I'm from College of Business and Information Technology. Today, on behalf of our university and behalf of our college and our Dean, Bahaman Mirsab, I welcome you to this event. It is my pleasure now to introduce you to our President and CEO of Lawrence Tech University, Dr. Virender Modgaon. Dr. Modgaon.
Thank you. Thank you, Meena, and good morning, everyone, and our panelists. Thank you. This is my fortune that each time we meet Exec to Tech series, I had opportunity to meet all of you that I haven't met before. Many are return visitors. We are delighted with your loyalty to the program. I may also take the opportunity because each time we meet, there is something new to tell you, which is Lawrence Tech is evolving. With every visit you come here, either there's a new building, new program, new accreditation. So I was very delighted that this is a dynamic place. And Executive to Executive series is also a good example of what we are about, that students have 3 areas of learning, which is central to all disciplines: innovation, entrepreneurship, and leadership. So leadership is almost personified with the panel or Executive to Executive series. Many of you are executives, others may be on way to being executives. So we have a marvelous panel of 3 millennial leaders, executives, who will share their thoughts, advice, and experiences. At the same time, we are now at a place where we are about in short time celebrating the 84th commencement of Lawrence Tech. University, yes, please. You want to clap? Thank you. Lawrence Tech started as Lawrence Institute of Technology in 1932 at Model T plant of Henry and Edsel Ford. Father and son invited our founding president to start a different type of institution during the Great Depression that could train students as soon as they graduate. They're out in the world helping economic growth. When banks were closed, 50% unemployment, Lawrence Tech took that lead to create a different type of graduate. And that was under the theme of theory and practice, that whatever, regardless of your discipline, you learn in a classroom, studio, or laboratory, you must practice it. And that has been the guiding light for this institution for 84, 86 years, and so forth. So with that, I take leave of you, but I again express my great welcome. We are a great institution only because you love us and you take time from your very important works to be here to share what you know and listen to others. Thank you, enjoy it. And thank you, the panelists.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Adam Counts. I'm from Plant Moran. I'm an audit manager in our not-for-profit practice. And with me today, I have 3 not-for-profit executive leaders who are all millennials. And we're here to really learn today, one, about millennials, but also about not-for-profits in the city of Detroit, where they see the city's future going, how they're making an impact today. But I couldn't do justice of introducing some of these people as well as their organizations, so I'm going to let them go through and introduce themselves, how you got to your organizations. Tell us a little bit about your organizations. I'll start with you, Kuhu.
Hi, everybody. Is this on? Hello? Yes. Okay. Good morning. My name is Kuhu Saha. I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called Give Merit in the city of Detroit, which I actually started with a friend of mine soon after I graduated from the University of Michigan. We've been around for about 8 years. So my background, I grew up in Troy, Michigan. I went to the University of Michigan, got my degree in sociology and American culture. And afterwards, had a placement in AmeriCorps in the VISTA program, working with high school programs in Washtenaw County on civic engagement, philanthropy, youth development, youth leadership. And during that time, a friend of mine and I decided we wanted to start a business, but we wanted there to be a social element to it. It was a t-shirt company with a community service element. We ran that for about 2 years, learned a lot, and then took our learnings and put it to good use by starting 2 organizations. That was back in 2011. Our mission is to help young people in the city of Detroit do 3 things. We talk about helping them aspire, find things they're passionate about. We feel like we've sort of failed as a community in really lifting our young people up and allowing them to dream and go after their passions. And so we want to give them space to aspire. We want to instill confidence in them to believe in themselves. And we want them to take those 2 first words, to aspire and to believe, to go out and contribute back to their communities. And so we do that in 2 ways. We have a for-profit company called Merit, M-E-R-I-T, which is a for-profit clothing brand. We use product design and style to drive social impact, raise awareness around issues in youth and education in the city of Detroit, and also donating 20% of our profits to the youth program that we run in the city. The second thing is our nonprofit, Give Merit, which I mentioned earlier. For the last almost 8 years, we've facilitated 1 primary program called FATE, F-A-T-E, which is a 4-year cohort-based program working with high school students in the city of Detroit, starting in the 9th grade, offering real-life experiences with entrepreneurship. And so the way it kind of circles back is that the students in our program each year work on a capstone project that falls under the brand. 9th grade, they work on developing a marketing and advertising campaign for the brand. They spend the first 6 to 7 months of the school year with community partners like Zingerman's, Donor Advertising, a lot of others, Leo Burnett, Plant Moran is a partner in the 9th grade year, where they're learning about basic budgeting and things like that. And they're learning just elements of marketing and advertising, and by the end of the year, they're broken up into 5 teams, and each team is tasked with creating a 60-second commercial and a print ad. We bring in professionals, videographers, graphic designers, et cetera, to bring those to life. And 14-year-olds stand in front of a room of around 150 to 200 people and pitch their campaigns. The winning team, the campaign is used by the brand, and so they're not only doing this hypothetically, but they are getting real-life experience in the real world doing real things. And so each year has a project like that, and I won't take up too much more time.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Paul, why don't you give yourself an introduction?
Yeah, hey everybody. Can everybody hear me out there? Yes, great. I'm Paul Mack. I'm the executive director at Detroit Experience Factory. I'm sitting between 2 founders. I actually succeeded a founder of 13 years, an executive director of 13 years that started the organization that I lead. I came to that role through a pretty varied resume before that. I did my undergrad at Michigan State in human biology and philosophy and bioethics, and then did a couple of years in IT for an insurance company, realized I wanted to be working with people a lot more, and came to Wayne State for my master's degree, and studied social work, macro social work. So since then, my work has focused a lot around human behavior in large groups. What happens in organizations, structures, communities, neighborhoods, clubs, families is probably about the smallest I would think about, and even those, it's usually broader than a nuclear family. And a lot of that for me has focused around people's stories and who they are and how they build their identities, how they understand themselves, and what that means for broadly how we all interact with each other. I taught for a few years in Detroit. I really also have a pretty strong passion for youth. Really interesting to hear about what you're doing with Give Merit. We should talk more. Wanted to have more front lines experience. My degree tends to lead to doing things at the organizational level, and I did not have social services experience, and wanted that before I started doing leadership-oriented things. So teaching was a great way to do that, was working with kids day in, day out, all day. Teenagers shape you in a way that no one else can, as I think both of these guys could probably talk about as well. And then went to work for Deloitte. I did human capital consulting, moved back to a very large organizational level, doing all kinds of different projects, looking at how to help organizations function well relative to their people, and the things that people bring with them into work life. Realized in doing that, I was working on some really amazing national and international projects that, like, in hindsight seemed really amazing. Then I just realized I wanted to be here in Detroit and was not passionate or as excited about them as I should be based on what they were doing. And so I started looking to be back here in the city. Part of why I stayed after my master's degree was I fell in love with Detroit. I bought a house here, remodeled it myself, was very involved in a lot of other community things happening in the city. and ended up landing this role, which has been perfect. Detroit Experience Factory is a tour organization, which a lot of people, when they hear tours, they think like double-decker buses and that's not what we do, right? Like, we'll certainly still tell you a lot of the facts and stories and landmarks and things about Detroit, but we believe at Detroit Experience Factory that a place is about the people and the history there, and we want to embrace that in a really complex way. So our tours, about 70% of them leave the 7.2 Central Business District and go out into the neighborhoods. We very often in our tours stop and go into small businesses and the business owner themselves. We talk about wanting to hand over the microphone or amplify other people's stories. And so we work to help people see what people are doing, what Detroiters are doing around the city. And the folks that have been here for a long time, the folks that are rooted in their communities and in their neighborhoods, whether that's as a block club leader or a business owner, or working within some kind of community organization, or in a lot of other aspects of leadership as well. That could go all the way to working for a large organization like United Way or DEGC. And we help people wrestle with the complexity of Detroit's history and what's happening today on those tours. My favorite aspect about that is that I think when we just talk about people's stories, like sitting here in this room, we could talk about all kinds of Detroit stories. That's good and that's hopeful, but it's so different to talk about Detroit and the city and its story when you're there. You're on a bus looking at the things in the neighborhoods, getting out, walking around, standing in someone's business and hearing their story about their business. That I think has a very different impact and facilitates a very different kind of conversation between people that I think can help us connect in more authentic ways. So that's, I think, a big part of our goal as Detroit Experience Factory is to help people connect authentically to Detroit stories. And for us, we take a bent on that of focusing on equity and inclusion, particularly around prosperity. So how do we make sure that what's happening, the growth in Detroit is more accessible to all kinds of people from all kinds of backgrounds and recognizing the ways that that's already happening across the city.
So it sounds like you might get an introduction here, but maybe you're soliciting some tours.
Yes, if you'd like to know more, you should go on a tour, DetroitExperienceFactory.org. Happy to show you around the city. We do both public tours and private tours, so you can jump on a tour through an Eventbrite link to one of the tours which is publicly available. You can also call us, and for a relatively reasonable cost, we can get you and any number of your best friends on a bus or on a walking tour around the city.
Thanks. And next up is Courtney Smith from the Detroit Phoenix Center. And before I introduce, Paul can probably attest, I first saw you speak at the Detroit Policy Conference, and I got goosebumps when you did it and when you introduced your organization and why you're doing what you're doing. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, of course. First of all, I want to thank you so much for having me here. I want to thank Kuhu and Paul for being on this panel and being champion change makers in the community. It's so amazing. And also to Plant Moran for having this event. My name is Courtney Smith, and I'm the founder and executive director of the Detroit Phoenix Center. We're a nonprofit organization that provides critical resources, support, and a safe, nurturing environment for homeless and high-risk youth in the city of Detroit. I'm a native Detroiter, been here my whole life, experienced a lot of trauma, from my childhood, growing up unstably housed and recognizing the impact that it not only had on my life, but those who were in my family. It kind of was birthed pretty organically. I can't say that when I graduated from college, that I wanted to start a nonprofit organization, that I wanted to be an executive, or not so soon, right? So Detroit Phoenix Center was really birthed out of a great need in our community. I had recently graduated from college, and I was staying in a house with 3 other roommates, and I noticed that my youngest brother and some of his peers were like coming into the house, who at the time they were teenagers and they were experiencing some housing insecurity. And so I was blowing up air mattresses in the basement and passing out food and just opening the home, and my roommates were complaining like, all the food is missing, like why do you keep having these kids like come in and out, like this isn't like what's up, like something has to be done. Our landlord threatened to evict me, and I had to tell them all to leave. I actually had connected them to other resources in the community, with my brother, connected him to siblings, with his friends, connected him to other programs, but then they kept cycling through. I noticed like there was this pattern of constant mobility, and I'm like, well, where do people like these group of youth go when they just need to take a shower, when they need to eat, just because they aren't necessarily what people consider housing ready, it doesn't mean that they don't deserve their basic needs. And so I was sitting on the couch one day and I saw this ad, just looking through it. It was like, do you want to change the world? Like, is there something in your community that's burdening you? Do you want to be a change maker? And I was like, yes.
Spoke to the inner millennial of you.
Take this journey across the country with 25 other millennial change makers. And so I hopped on a train. It was called the Millennials Train Project, and we traveled to 6 major cities by train, and we had to choose a cause that was prevalent to us and that we were passionate about to solve. And so in each community that we stopped in, I interviewed founders, executive directors, and youth that were currently experiencing housing insecurity or having some challenges within their community. And what I found out was there was a huge disconnect between what the youth said that they needed and what the founders and the leaders of these of these organizations that were serving these young people that they needed. When I would talk to the young people, they would say that their voices weren't heard, that they felt like there were too many rules in these programs. There were a lot of zero tolerance policies. I remember one young person in particular said, "You don't know what I'm going through. Why are you trying to talk to me?" And when I opened up and shared about my own experience in Detroit and some of those who I saw personally, it opened up a world to these youth and how they connected with me, how they opened up to me. And it was one young lady in particular, I thanked her for her interview. Was incredibly just moving, and the resiliency in her journey really spoke to me. And she said to me, "The best way that you can thank me is to go back to your own community and to serve the youth in your community." And so when I came back to Detroit, I convened a group of youth, my brother included, and some of the youth that he introduced me to, and I sat down with them and I conducted a focus group. And what I learned also on this journey was the best way, according to U.S. News Report, to serve youth who are experiencing homelessness was through this idea of a drop-in center. And it's a low barrier approach where a young person can literally just drop in to take a shower, to wash their clothes, to access a food pantry, we have also programming in the center in terms of life skills, educational workshops. We do the GDYT, workforce development. So it's really just a robust one-stop shop where young people can come in to actually gain stability and also be connected to other resources in the community. So we convened this group of youth. The Detroit Phoenix Center, it's always been by youth, for youth, and so we really elevate our young leaders through a youth action board that we actually sat down with them and gave them our policy manual and really empowered them to tell us what was the best way to serve them. And so to make a very long story short, we opened the drop-in center in 2017. During this time, a very tragic event happened in my personal life. My youngest brother transitioned, and that was a really big turning point in my life. I was working full-time at the time while leading Detroit Phoenix Center. I was working full-time for a federally funded nonprofit here in the city in an executive role. And it was a moment where it was like, this isn't just a passion project. Like, losing my brother was a moment of these young people who are street connected. This work is a matter of life and death. And it moves me in a way that I've never been moved before. And so I transitioned out of my full-time paid salaried position job to to do this work full-time. And thankfully, through this time, we were able to secure some very great donors. It's only been 2 years, and we had started with a budget of $10,000 from the train. They gave us 5 people who were on the train received $10,000 to launch their initiative in their community. And 2 years later, we have an operating budget of $500,000. So we've been moving pretty fast. But the impact is always what speaks, right? We need the dollars to do the work, but from our drop-in facility, we've since, opened up an emergency shelter. And the way that we've been moving has not been necessarily out. I can't say it's been good business acumen and strategy, but it's really been based off a need. We were the first and only organization to open a drop-in center here in the city of Detroit. When we opened up our emergency winter shelter, there was no other shelter in the city of Detroit for the population that we served. From the emergency shelter, what we saw was, like, our young people, they don't just need emergency respite. Like, they need a holistic approach to meeting not only their basic needs, but their human needs. And so we were part of the MBK Innovation Challenge, and we won that, and we were able to open up our transitional youth home, which couples the young people that's living in the transitional youth home with workforce development opportunities. So they actually are now transitioning to work for our organization and receive what is equivalent to what a living wage is for them, and to be empowered to not only to complete high school, but to go on to college and to really move beyond crisis to a place of stability and to actualize what their full potential is. And so those, like, our three major programs right now is our drop-in center, our emergency shelter that just runs during the winter. We partner with the faith-based community to be able to launch that. And then our newest program, which has been a labor of love, and I mean that in the truest sense, is our transitional youth house that we opened about a month ago in East English Village. So we're in the North End, and then also our house is in East English Village. And yeah, so that's, Detroit Phoenix Center. We are a small but mighty organization, very small.
And growing.
And so, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Next up, we want to briefly talk about, defining a millennial, but in the three of yours eyes, when we start talking about millennials, the good stereotypes, the bad stereotypes, and the people that you work with in the not-for-profit industry, I guess, what would you define a millennial as? What are some of the good stereotypes? What are some of the bad stereotypes? I personally see, I'm guilty of this myself. I want to make an impact, and I want to make it instantaneously. So I'm not patient, and that can be good, and that can be bad. I think it's a double-edged sword. But what would the three of you say?
I would agree with that one. I also think we think we can do anything, which I think can be a good thing.
Yeah. That's a double-edged sword.
And is not a good thing sometimes as well. But we definitely think that, we can make a change, similar.
But that's why you are all sitting here, though, as well, right?
Sure, yeah. When we started, originally, I was like 22 years old, but what I didn't mention earlier is that there's a scholarship promise associated with our program. So if students uphold certain standards, they can receive a $5,000 scholarship to the college of their choice, or so on and so forth. So speaking of a small budget, it was small to start, but by 4 years in 2016, I had to have $125,000 raised. And when we went to our partner schools, we were like, I was 24 years old, and they're like, you're not gonna raise that money. Like, you've never done this before. I had a full-time job when we first started out, and but we were like, yeah, we are. So it's the whole, we can do anything. And
aspirational.
And we did.
Yep.
So that's great. We did, and we were able to give scholarships to everyone who earned them 4 years later in 2016. But I think that's one of the biggest things about millennials.
We don't take no for an answer.
Yeah, which is not always a good thing. Yeah.
Paul?
I think of, and this has especially become clear to me as I've watched the next generation coming after us start to kind of come of age, that I think of millennials as the people that lived through the coming of the digital age. So I almost imagine what it must have been like for my grandparents when they were kids. A lot of things were still handmade, that by the time they were my age, adults, early adulthood, maybe even in their mid-20s, were all done by machines. That change happened in the 20, 30 years of their coming of age. For us as millennials, we've seen a similar kind of change, but about digital, right? I remember when Instant Messenger first became a thing, and we've even watched, it was when I was in high school, right? And it was AOL Instant Messenger, which no one uses anymore. They just closed it down. It was a momentous thing for people our age. And we've watched cycles of that, of what's happened with the internet, what's happened with the way that text communication happens, with the devices that we use for that. And so we've gone through several cycles of the coming of the digital era, And I say I've come to a clear understanding of that because it's really fascinating to me as a person who's lived through all of that and talking with my peers that have lived through all that to watch a 22-year-old that just exists in the digital era. They don't even think about the fact that there used to not be smartphones. There used to not be Snapchat, Instagram, fill in your favorite app and social media and communication medium. Those used to not all be there. And we remember that and we know that and we've lived through all of that. And I think that defines a lot of how we think about communication. Like I think it's obviously the tools themselves. It defines how we use technology and do our work. But it also defines how we think about relationships, how we think about people, how we think about organizational structure and governance. What was possible when we were younger and first started to think about those things versus what's possible today is just an entirely different world. And it's really shaped how millennials approach the world and other people.
Courtney?
Yeah, when I think of millennials, I think of system disruption. I think that for so long there was a system set in place where you worked, you received your, 401k, you worked a 9 to 5, you set up for retirement. That's the system that our parents have built traditionally, right? And so I think that a lot of millennials don't want to work like that, to engage in that system if that work is not fulfilling. There was values that were instilled that you set your family up for success, and your personal satisfaction comes last. But for millennials, I think that we have found a way to do social good, make a living, and still to give back to our community. I think that is something that speaks volumes when I think about even the culture of philanthropy, being a millennial, leading an organization that often has to raise money. A lot of times people say like millennials are selfish, and we are the poorest generation in the sense of like finances, but in terms of like social impact and living a fulfilled life, I think that millennials hold those values truer than any dollar amount can attach to that. And so I think that even as I'm raising money, I'm learning that the collective impact of millennials, it goes a very long way. So it's not necessarily the high income family that's writing a check of $5,000. It's 500 of my friends coming together and say, we'll give you 10, we'll give you 25, and packing out fundraising events with just $25 checks, right? But noticing that us as a collective, we make a big difference. And also in terms of giving time, I think that in the past, as a seasoned, philanthropists, they typically just are able to like, okay, give checks. We don't have time to give our time. But what I noticed about millennials is that we want to see directly where our impact is going. And so if that means spending 5 hours at your organization painting walls, we would rather do that than just to write a check and not know where it's going. Just because of in the nonprofit sector, for organizations that we've seen grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and seeing administrative dollars not impact directly the people that's being served by the organization. So I think that we want to disrupt systems that have failed and to be able to show innovative ways to get things done. For instance, I remember one time we were running a fundraising campaign and I was asking people to give, and I'm like, why isn't anybody giving money? And then as soon as I put our Cash App up on our Cash App link, yes, and it's like the money just started flooding in, and it's like we actually look at using digital, and then also things happening fast, right? A combination of all those things to actually do good and to have an impact and to make an investment that we see will yield value.
Thanks. I want to ask you all about why you chose the not-for-profit industry. You spoke about it already, Courtney. It was based on need. You saw a need within Detroit, and that's why you wanted to get into the industry. All three of you don't have ceilings with wherever you want to go. So I ask, why the not-for-profit industry? You talked a little bit about budgets and how they can be very tight. So monetarily, it could not be the best for y'all. You probably could have lucrative careers in a for-profit industry, but why the not-for-profit industry?
You want to start, Paul? I keep starting.
Go for it, Paul.
Shoot, I was hoping you'd give me time to think for a little longer. I actually am not very attached to whether I work for a not-for-profit or a for-profit. I kind of hope that at some point we trash that model. And
It's just the tax status, right?
Yeah, I think that's actually one thing I would point out is that it's a tax status, and it also, and there's a lot that's changing about the expectations of nonprofits, how philanthropy works that you were talking about. So the question feels difficult for me to answer because my choice isn't based on whether an organization, and in fact, with the XF, when I came into the role, one of the big questions we had to answer was whether we stayed as a not-for-profit. We're launching from our parent organization, Downtown Detroit Partnership. We've been there for 4 or 5 years now, and had to determine what our new organizational entity would be, either as a LLC or a 501c3 were the two options. And it was purely just a tax decision. It was like, well, we are still gonna be doing things that merit donations, and so we need to be able to take donations, and that's either gonna have to happen by someone else taking them for us and paying us, if we're an LLC, or us taking them ourselves. Well, that wasn't easier. So it was purely just a logistical decision. I think my choices about where I decide to spend my time and energy do have to do with some of the things that I've already heard you guys say. I want to be meeting needs. I'm fortunate that I am able to make enough money to live a pretty decent life, and honestly, I'd rather live a decent enough life and then work to make a difference in something. I could see that being in a for-profit company or a nonprofit company. I do think that there's something about the not-for-profit ceiling, in a sense, so the way that the business functions when it is in the nonprofit tax status works similar in some ways to the way that like a partnership would work, or a small family-owned business works. Where does profit go? Well, in a nonprofit, it has to all go back into the organization and the mission. You either pay your people better, you do more work for your mission, you hire more people, you invest in capital things that can serve your mission in some way, like hard real estate or materials or equipment, et cetera. And so all of your money has to go back to the thing. I think that one of the worst parts about the for-profit world is there's a lack of connection and accountability to where that money goes. People can do really selfish and stupid and greedy things with their money. So I think that part of the model does work for me. I also think I've worked for a few partnerships and a few family-owned businesses that in some ways work the same way. They're accountable to their communities. And so the money has to ultimately serve real people in a real way, and there's accountability there.
Okay.
Go for it.
So similarly, I guess, Doug Stewart from the Fisher Foundation often talks about how nonprofits should be referred to as for-impact organizations, not as not-for-profits. And his goal is for people to start using that lingo, which I'm not necessarily using that lingo.
Let's start using it
but
here.
Let's start using it. But I think that, my why really stems from, I always wanted to run a nonprofit, so it's different in that way.
A for-impact?
In a for-impact. I always wanted to run a for-impact organization. I didn't think it would happen so fast. I didn't think it would happen so soon. But that was of interest to me. Working with youth was of interest to me, and it wasn't really until the last maybe like 2 or 3 years that I figured out why that might be the case, and why it's sort of manifested in the way it has in the work that I'm doing now with young people. So I look back, so my parents immigrated here from India in the 70s, and they chose to stay here and build a life here because they had 3 girls, and they wanted them to have really bright futures, right? My dad was an engineer, he's a mechanical engineer, and my mom works for Henry Ford now, but they wanted, really bright lives, and I think that, their preference would have been that those lives were, that we became engineers or doctors. That didn't happen for any of us, but we all do some sort of for-impact work, actually. But I think as I've reflected back on sort of their choices and the sacrifices they made to stay in this country, to provide really bright lives for us, I sort of took advantage of the fact that I had all these great opportunities. I grew up in a really great educational system. I got to go to one of the best universities in the world. I got a really great education, which I often took for granted. Afterwards, I got to decide what I wanted to do. And I chose this, and that's just not the case for most people, right? That there's we all know about the achievement gap that exists, but what's even more prevalent and maybe less talked about is the opportunity gap that exists, that there are so many young people who aren't provided those opportunities that I took for granted all the time. And I have the distinct privilege of being able to provide opportunities like that, or provide a platform for opportunities like that. I think we all do. And that's my why. I think that they did that for me, and I didn't really earn it, but I can do that for other people, and it's just very fulfilling work.
Courtney, anything else to add?
Yes, and I think that that's both of you guys, like very powerful and inspirational. So thank you for sharing. And just to piggyback off what Kuhu said, yes, there was a need, right? But coming from the background that I came from, growing up the way that I grew up, a lot of young people who look like me, who grew up in the city of Detroit, who lived life in the city of Detroit. Time magazine named Detroit one of the worst places for a child to live, and seeing like how childhood trauma affects your life as an adult, and being able to see the opportunities that I was presented with that I fought very, very hard for, coming through foster care, living in homeless shelters, working incredibly hard to build relationships and to sustain them, right? And also to go to college and graduate with honors, and to work incredibly hard, literally fighting for my own life, right? And seeing young people who are in Detroit not necessarily know that there are opportunities that exist outside of your current reality. When I interact with the youth that I serve, as we're even building our organization, I want them to know that it doesn't matter what your situation looks like, that there are opportunities that exist, that there is a program and persons, similar to all the work that you're doing, that's gonna fight for you because you are worth fighting for. One of my favorite quotes is like, every young person deserves a champion, a supportive adult who will never give up on them, to show them that they can be the best that they can be. And I think that the person-centered approach, working in the For Impact, is what continues to drive me in the work. I mean, I've worked in the for-profit sector. I've worked for really big nonprofit organizations. I'm fortunate enough to live a very comfortable life, which did not seem possible for me at a very young age. And so that is why I continue to do the work that I do. I would eventually like to transition into higher ed, but that's not, like, we're not, these lives are not, like, they're linear, right? So any of us could transition at any point, but even higher ed is still nonprofit. So yeah, I'm not gonna go off on a tangent.
We're gonna take a little bit of a shift towards Detroit, towards the opportunities that we see in Detroit. I think you all have seen a need for the city, whether it's at-risk youth, whether it's education within the city and providing opportunities to youth, whether it's providing awareness about the entire city and all of its neighborhoods. Where do you see the future of the city? Where are the opportunities? Do you think that we're up to the challenges? I'll let whoever wants to start with it. I personally see a lot more focus on the micro. I do see a lot of the conferences I go to, people start talking more and more and more about the neighborhoods and focusing on the neighborhoods. The development has been good within the downtown area and the midtown area, and to the extent coming up New Center. But then I think people are starting to focus on the needs in the neighborhoods, but also just what some of the bedrock needs are, whether it's education, at-risk youth who just need a place to go, that sort of thing. What would you all say?
I can start, I guess.
Go for it.
I think, so I have an interesting view. I think Courtney's take on this is going to be very interesting because you've seen Detroit for your whole life. I grew up in the suburbs. I remember coming to Detroit to see the fireworks, to go to games, and that was pretty much it. My interest in Detroit peaked in college when it still wasn't, that was still early 2000s, so it still wasn't where it is today. I think I look at Detroit through the lens of the kids that we serve, and the very real reality of it to me is that there are two Detroits, and it's, sometimes that's talked about, sometimes it's not. There are very shiny parts of the city. Downtown is beautiful, the Riverwalk is beautiful, Midtown is awesome, Corktown is coming up, New Center is coming up, all of these neighborhoods that we've talked about, it's awesome. The kids that I work with don't go to those places. That's not Detroit. Detroit is still their street, their cross streets, the store on the corner, like that's Detroit to them. And if most of my kids haven't heard of Shinola. Like they've only heard of Shinola because we took them to Shinola. Otherwise before that they had never heard of that. And if you ask people from around the place, Shinola is the thing they've heard about.
Yep.
Saving Detroit, right? That was that is something that's still very real, and I think will be for a long time. Because while there is sort of this trend to think about the neighborhoods, I personally don't believe that that's real yet. That
No actions have come of it.
It's the cool thing to talk about right now that we want to invest in the neighborhoods, but and there's been some intentional investment in some neighborhoods, but Detroit is huge. It's so big. There are so many neighborhoods. There are people who have been long neglected, and even amidst the trend of I'm going to sort of invest in this neighborhood or this neighborhood, they're still very neglected. We're located in a neighborhood. We're on the corner of Grand River and Livernois off the Grand River exit in 96. And that is, I think, an interesting place to be because it's not shiny yet. And I think that we've sort of taken it upon ourselves. So we're located behind a big church in the city, Straight Gate Church. Our founder and my business partner is David Merritt, who is the son of Bishop Merritt, who has been in the city for 40 years. They've been in that location for 30. And, I think, it's going to take resident support, neighborhood activation, and also community partner activation of people who are in those neighborhoods and care about them to work on them. But bringing it back is sort of like I don't even know what that means altogether. I think like Detroit never went anywhere. We just forgot about it. And I'm guilty of that as well. And I'd love to play a role in that, but I also recognize, again, my privilege in wanting to play a role in that and wanting to understand that it's really not about me. And so my perspective always comes from the lens of our kids and really recognizing that what we instill in them, what I was talking about earlier is, the aspire, believe, contribute, but really the fact that they can create the future and how can we sort of provide the opportunity for them to do so and to have a role in what Detroit looks like in their future.
Go for it.
My mantras is that a lot of people think that the most important social justice work is to be done with the marginalized, the under-resourced, the impoverished, fill in the blank in which term you want to use there. But the less privileged, the folks that don't have a lot of access to resources. And I think that work is really important, extremely important, but I don't think it's the most important social justice work. I think that work is actually done with the privileged because they are people that have power, that have resources, that are, you talked about the opportunity gap, which in the way you were describing it, I heard a choice gap. Privileged people are the one that make most of the choices in our society. Hearing Courtney's story, those choices shape what other people's lives end up looking like and what choices are available to them. So if we want to make an impact on social justice, really a lot of the most impactful work is to be done with the people that are privileged, that are making those choices and helping them understand the impact of the choices they're making, the ways they spend money, the ways they shape philanthropy, the ways they run their businesses, the ways they live their personal lives. Your personal choices with your money impact the quality of other people's lives. Your choices of where you live, where you buy a house, how you raise your kids impacts other people's lives and what happens with their lives in ways that they cannot control, only you can. And that is a conversation that is palpable and happening in Detroit. It's painful at times. It should be. That's okay. It's uncomfortable. That's okay. And I hope that that's one of the things that's part of the future of Detroit, is that we we open ourselves to having those really uncomfortable conversations about the way that privilege, or the lack of privilege, shapes our lives, and that we work to hold ourselves, and I say ourselves because I consider myself a pretty privileged person, accountable to how we make choices within our privilege, and accountable to making choices in a way that lift up other people's ability to make their own life choices. Because I think one of the most immoral and unjust things you can do is make choices that lift yourself up at the cost of someone else having less or worse choices in life. And I think often we've lost that conversation in our society in the US at large. I see those conversations happening pretty actively around the future of Detroit, and I think that is really important. I think it's part of why we do what we do at DXF. A lot of the folks on our tours are privileged people, and it's important for them to engage the complexity of like a real place, real Detroiters that are running a business, working in a community, have lived in this neighborhood for 30 years and have to think about that to get beyond the trope of like, I have a black friend or I have a gay friend or whatever, and actually live in community with people that are different than you and have to wrestle to understand their stories, and to understand your own story relative to someone that's different than you. It's really easy to think that your story makes complete sense when everyone else around you has the same story. Your story becomes a lot more difficult to live in when you have to recognize that not everybody in the globe has the same story. So I think that that's one of the things I hope for Detroit, and I see it when I visit other cities. I don't see other cities wrestling with this in the same way that we are in Detroit, that I think we can really hold up a model for the world of how we make space for those kinds of conversations that then lead to different kinds of community and choice-making structures.
Courtney?
I honestly believe that both of you really hit the nail on the head. But what I would add, without repeating anything that you said, that I also believe that the future of Detroit lies within us, and our ability to shape and to create and to empower others to do the slow and humble work, to mobilize, to empower our young people. Something that I said at the Detroit Policy Conference that really resonated with a lot of people was that, you know, Detroiters are saving Detroit, right? And that's where the future of Detroit lies. And I think that it's empowering those who lived in those communities for 30 plus years and providing them with the resources to lead, because they have the answers. They didn't forget about Detroit. Detroit people forgot about them. We've always been here, and it's always been, hey, look at us. And I think that now, as the development is coming, that you distribute those resources to people who have invested in their communities. And so I think partnering with, you know, people like the Merritts, who've been around for 40 plus years, great leaders in our community, and recognizing the privilege and using that opportunity that you have to bridge that gap, to be able to speak to those with privilege and say, like, look, there's another narrative that's not being told. So it's using our own power, our own stories, our collective voices to move Detroit forward, and also empowering our young people. Like, at the end of the day, like, they are gonna be our leaders, and not neglecting them. Like, they are gonna be so much more equipped than we are with the digital age, and also recognizing that even with the digital age, there's also a digital divide, right? And so even just investing in tech and empowering young people to even bridge gaps in literacy. 47% of Detroiters are illiterate. So looking at those who are in the community, who've lived in the community, and invest in that, I think that that is the future of Detroit, because it's always been the present of Detroit. It's just that it's been neglected. And I'm happy that we're having these conversations. I'm happy to even be here with you guys and to even learn of a different perspective that I may not even have known. So I think that these conversations, have more of these conversations.
I've never felt more like a millennial executive than when Courtney said something amazing and I had to pull out my phone to write it down. So, yep.
One last question for you all. Recruiting millennial talent, not only to your 4 impact organizations, but more so to your 4 impact causes. How do we do that? How do we get people to buy in, whether that's monetarily, whether that's to start working for a 4 impact, whether that is to volunteer their time, whether that is to volunteer their attention to be a part of that conversation? Where do you see that opportunity, and how do we spread awareness? Because I feel like that's one of the ways that we can help Detroit. Do you want to start with you, Paul? Sure. I see you thinking over there. The wheels turning.
I think it was really interesting, some of the things we shared that define millennials at the beginning, because I would also maybe caveat that I think that defines millennial leadership. Some of the stuff that I've read about millennials writ large and research on their thinking, on their choices, et cetera, it's really fascinating because I think the way that millennial leaders look is different than the way that kind of the silent majority of our peers, however you want to think of it, looks. A lot of millennials want a lot of security. They've grown up in a constantly changing world, and so there's ways that they seek stability amidst that. And there's a lot of nostalgia. And I guess some of what that leads me to is that I think I think it's really easy to almost take like a shiny object approach when you're trying to engage millennials, which is ultimately ends up being insulting. Like as a millennial, I feel insulted when people are like, "Look, shiny object, you should get excited. You're a millennial," and I'm like, "What the is that? Like, no, don't throw that at me. Treat me like a thoughtful human, and also slow down a little bit." This is slow and humble work was what I had to write down. I think that actually is some of what I would say about engaging millennials. Is certainly it matters to appeal to purpose, appeal to passion, be clear and be authentic about who you really are, what you care about, why you're doing it, and why that person should get involved, might want to get involved based on who they are, what they care about, why they do what they do, but also make space for that slow and humble space of engagement, because most people are trying to live their lives. They're trying to figure out how to take care of themselves, take care of their families, take care of their communities and their loved ones, and so you have to make the slow and humble space for really authentic engagement. I think it's one of the things that millennials crave the most, because it has been one of the hardest things for us to create in this insanity of the coming of the digital age, has been authentic community, authentic relationships, authentic connections. Relationship worlds have turned upside down in how they function in our coming of age, our adulthood so far. And so when you make space for authentic community and relationships, I think that draws millennials in, because that's when that is the kind of authentic community and relationships that they're looking for, because that's one of the things we most need. And it's also a thing that aligns really well with driving for impact work.
Courtney?
I think that when recruiting millennial talent, I think that it's important to look at some of the value systems and that millennials hold, and align the position or opportunity with those value systems, because millennials aren't traditionally you stayed at jobs for 3+ years. Research shows that millennials are hopping from job to job to job. It's searching fulfillment, searching authentic relationships. I think that social media has really blurred lines in terms of this professional, this silo life that we were told to live, in terms of this professional and this personal life. I think that a lot of millennials value just who a person is, and that lends to authentic relationships. I found that a lot of millennials have really sought out the work that we do at Detroit Phoenix Center due to the transparency and the vulnerability and the ugliness of the work. We want, a lot of millennials want to fix things, want to do good. And so I think for us, it's been kind of organic to recruit and to engage a lot of millennial talent, just because of the organization is millennial driven, it's millennial led. And so I think that that draws in, because the value systems align. I also think that there are some very practical things, right, in terms of like social media incorporate the digital world into the opportunities that exist. I think that millennials want to do good in a shorter amount of time. Like, we really value the time that we have doing good, which is interesting because we spend hours on social media doing absolutely nothing. But there is like an intentional effort with time. Like, how does this impact me and how does it impact the world? So I think that even timing, like the whole, 8-hour shifts. I read a book by Millennial, it was like the 4-hour like work week. Like, so I think that is something that millennials are looking for, that also kind of piggybacks off the negative. Like, we're impatient, we want things fast. And so that's not necessarily always a negative. I think that anything that you look at can be viewed in a positive light depending on how it's channeled and depending on how it operates. And so I think that, just in one sentence, I think that creating opportunities that align with the value systems that millennials hold, but then also recognizing like millennial is not like a monolith, right? So talking and engaging those who work for the organization. I love to see when companies have like a young professionals board. I love when companies have, volunteer days for, millennials who work in their organization, or even just suggestions of like, how can we do what we do better?
So I'll speak specifically to our organization too in terms of recruitment, because this is actually a really big concern of ours on how to recruit and retain good talent. So when we started out, there were 2 of us, and there were 2 of us up until 2 years ago, where we added a third. And she has stuck with us for the last 2.5 years, and that's very exciting. And then this past August and September, we brought on 2 more. But we have some projects in the pipeline and some things coming up that's going to entail hiring more people.
Neat.
And the thing is, with the work that we do, is that consistency is very important. You're working with young people where there are inconsistencies in their lives, and as much consistency that you can provide in the work that we do is really important. And that goes in those high school years, that 9th through 12th grade years. So that means you want someone who's leading a cohort of students for 4 years. And as we've mentioned, they don't stay for 4 years. After that, we're building out an alumni program, because what we all should know now is that getting to college is actually the easy part.
Succeeding.
Getting through it after the fact is the really hard part, and we haven't been paying attention to that.
Graduating with $25,000 of debt without
Yep.
a degree is worse than not going to college?
All of it, and there isn't good support in place for once you get there. And so we're building out what that could look like for our students specifically, and that requires someone to be on board maybe for another 4 years. And so we're not looking for someone to come for 2 years and leave. I think there are other organizations, corporations, who maybe are better suited for that, for a hop in and out. But that's not what we want. And so actually what's interesting is that, for the last 8 years, like, we haven't offered any, like, I've paid for my own insurance, we haven't offered any benefits, and what those are the shiny objects, for lack of a better word, that we have to start providing, because even though there's impatience and even though there's things, there's also this desire for stability. There's also this reality of my parents' voice coming into my head about me, needing health insurance, and me like wanting to settle down somewhere with a good school system. And so the other thing that we're working against is people wanting to stay in Michigan, or wanting to come to Michigan, wanting to be in Detroit. Some people are really gung-ho about it. Most people still are not. And so these are all things that are of huge concern to us that we're actually trying to figure out. And part of it will be like me talking to someone about a benefits package for our employees, and other, interesting things. Like, the way that we think about what we can offer is not just the impact, but also like I think millennials, but people in general, are looking for more than just coming to work and leaving. They're looking for an experience, and they're looking for what else they can get out of the experience at work. And so something that we can offer, even when we have interns over the summer, is that it needs to be a learning experience, right? Like, you shouldn't just be filing our paperwork. You shouldn't just be like behind the computer all day. Yeah, you should be interacting with our students. You should be meeting other amazing professionals in the city. You should be seeing what Detroit has to offer. We should be wooing you in a way that's going to benefit you, that's going to make you a whole person. And so it's also us trying to figure out what that means for a full-time employee too, who probably needs to be behind a computer more than an intern does over the summer. So so we're still figuring that out, because I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's a very important point. So when I was thinking about volunteer engagement, I think about the one and done projects where we can bring in 60 volunteers and 50. So when it comes to the actual programming, that is a really good point, because we're very selective about those to engage. And also when we hire, we're very selective, simply because we do recognize the point that you made about, you know, especially with the youth that we serve, you have to be trauma informed, and knowing that you can't just be like in and out, because our youth have experienced so much of that. So that was a wonderful point. But I think that what we've been able to do is take the longer process to hire, and to hire literally the right people, because, you know, we're still young, and recognizing that sometimes it is our 80-hour-a-week job, and finding people who align with that is often hard. And so I just want to say power to you, and once you figure it out, just let us know.
Both of your comments made me think about too that I think sometimes there's this way we talk about millennials as if they're a fad, like, which to me is both problematic because history doesn't go backwards, and also because we are real people. So the things that have happened in millennials coming of age are things that happened with real people and real life. And I think if you're you're older than a millennial, there's an importance in sort of acceptance of that, I think, to maintain leadership, honestly. Like, to me, I do not trust a leader that treats millennials like they're a fad, because they don't get reality. They don't understand that these are people, and this is real, and this is gonna keep happening and going somewhere. I don't know where it's gonna go, neither do you, neither does any millennial, we don't know. But that it is happening, and that this is reality. And if you're a millennial or younger, I would also say the same thing for us, of sort of accepting, like, oh, the world we're living in is becoming this, and accepting that and living in it and making sense of it, rather than talking about it like it's some kind of pop culture fad. Like, I almost think there's a way of getting our thinking past fads, marketing, and kind of a post-pop culture mindset of, like, oh, like, this is now this is reality. Like, almost think when people talk about, like, someone that you're talking to via text, and like, well, when are you going to talk to them in real life? As if my text conversation isn't real life. Text is real life, thank you very much. There's certainly a difference between some of the ways that millennials navigate the world and the ways that those before us did. But I think that's important, that we recognize and have an acceptance of that, like, millennials are part of reality, and the trends are part of reality, not just some fad that other people can talk about and analyze. And I think that goes to wrestling with the dynamics you guys are talking about. Wrestling with those requires accepting them as part of today's reality for doing what you do.
I think we got about 15 minutes or so for questions. Before we open it up for questions, where can people learn more about your organizations? Where can they donate? Where can they donate monetarily? They're volunteer. Where can they take tours? Do you want to speak a little bit about that just real briefly before we open it up for questions? Is it your websites?
Yeah, so you can find Detroit Phoenix Center on DetroitPhoenixCenter.org. We're on Instagram, Detroit Phoenix Center. We're on Facebook, Detroit Phoenix Center. There you can Google us, and we're there. So, and we also, on our website, we have a volunteer application. We have a list of things that we're looking for in terms of donations and opportunities to engage and support our organization. But I think that even beyond that, just educating yourselves and people on the crisis of youth homelessness in our community is the best way that you can support our organization. well, the quickest, not the best. The best is to give money. But, but to raise awareness on the crisis, that is incredibly important.
Pay first, learn later. Kind of like that. Give me your money and then you can learn. Anyways, just sitting with that for a second. DetroitExperienceFactory.org is our website. You can find information about our public tour schedule there, or Detroit Experience Factory on Facebook. Our Instagram tag and our Instagram handle and our Twitter handle are at We Know Detroit. Google searching Detroit Experience Factory will find you all of those magical things on the interwebs, and would highly recommend getting out on any of our public tours. If you have a group of folks that you want to get together, highly recommend going to our website and submitting a request for a private tour and seeing what we can set up for you. Would also, those of you that are curious about learning more or passionate about kind of connecting folks to Detroit and Detroit's stories and some of the ways that I've talked about, like, shoot me an email. And my email's on our website, or you can grab a card from me at some point today.
Great. Our website is givemerit.org. You can also buy clothing at meritgoodness.com. We're a little more confusing than Detroit Phoenix Center and Detroit Experience Factory, actually, in that we have multiple social media handles. But if you want to learn more about our program, Fate, that I talked about, we're on Instagram at Fate Detroit, and also on Instagram at Merit Goodness.
Great. Let's give them a round of applause before we take it to questions. I guess I will be bringing out the microphone to you all real quick.
Thank you. One of the things that Paul mentioned, I kind of intuitively understand it, but it'll really help. You talked about the choices that the privileged make affects either the choices or the opportunity of choices that the underprivileged can make or not make. Can you just take an example of a choice that the privileged makes, how it affects the others, and both positively and negatively? I think I'm not challenging you. I'm just saying if you can give me an example. Thank you.
One example I would point out in Detroit is we chose to invest a lot of money in private transit infrastructure, our roads, and we did not invest that money in public transit infrastructure. That's great. It is absolutely phenomenal the way that our highways are set up if you are a person that can afford to own a car or in other ways access a car. It is destructive and massively painful for your life if you don't have those things, if you can't afford to own your own car and pay for all the things related to a car or have access to a car. And it's very easy to just say, like, oh, well, I'm just voting for or supporting the politicians that make sense to me. I'm just doing what any normal person should do, which is think about that I own a car, that I have money, I work hard for that money, and so our money should be spent on roads, because that's what works for me. And you are literally destroying other people's lives by refusing to invest in something that you could also benefit from, public transit, and use, instead of your private car, public transit, that would also benefit other people. So you have chosen a pathway, private transit, that benefits you at the cost of spending money on infrastructure that harms other people's ability to live their lives well. I don't think that's just an either or choice. We can have both private transit and public transit, but I think it's one really clear example where it's easy to think like, oh, I'm supporting spending more money on roads and I'm voting down the millage about public transit, and that's just about, I'm just making choices for me, but you're not. You're making choices for lots of other people that massively impact their life. And I think part of what it means to be part of a civil society is to certainly make your own personal choices for you, but also to recognize that when it comes to choices that impact other people, you have to think about more than yourself. I would point out some of the same things about how we talk and think about healthcare, making a choice just for you for healthcare, but not at least taking a moment to think about how that choice might impact other people, can also have some of those same impacts. Maybe to make it really micro, It's easy for me as an executive director to make choices about how my organization run, how people report to me about their work, how they organize their work, how our scheduling works, that work for me. I'm the executive director. I get to say how it goes. Like, that's fine. And that is true. That's the truth in an organization. It's part of my role is to help organize the way the work gets done. But if I don't recognize that as the privileged executive director, the way that I say we do team meetings, the way that I say we do scheduling, the way that I say that work gets talked about and reported on or performance evaluations happen impacts my team, I'm a tyrant. Like, I'm an awful person. If I want to be a good leader, I have to think about how using my privilege as a leader impacts my team members. Am I organizing the work in a way that helps them get their jobs done well? Am I organizing the work that makes them enjoy their jobs? So maybe that's a very micro example. When we make choices with privilege, when we can impact the lives of others, I think being an ethical person means looking at those choices and recognizing the impacts they have beyond ourselves, not just acting as if they are only sort of selfish choices, because they're not. We got one back here too.
First, I want to thank LTU for inviting this incredible panel of phenomenal executives. Thank you for coming, attending, and sharing your insights. Right now, we're going through an education of mental health awareness, pioneered by Oprah, Taraji P. Henson, Dr. Jess, Charlemagne, some of those celebrities. So is there any opportunity, such as when you're going through the tours in the city, you see some of the catastrophic results of lack of mental health awareness or just support, and in your organizations you spoke about a lot of the trauma that our youth and the people in Detroit are experiencing. So is there any opportunities in your organizations that couple the mental health awareness to help on that front?
So I mentioned just briefly about my youngest brother transitioning. My youngest brother transitioned by suicide. And so mental health awareness is incredibly important for our organization. Young people who are experiencing housing insecurity, young people who are experiencing homelessness are actually 8 times more likely than house youth to die by suicide and to have unearthed mental health challenges. So as a result of that and that very real phenomenon, when that happened, we quickly recognized our role in the mental health space. And so we started a conference that happens every year on Suicide Awareness Day. It's a Youth Empowerment Expo. And we provide on-site therapists, we provide tools and resources for young people to be able to recognize the signs and then also to be empowered to reach out for help, to seek help. We partner with other organizations who train parents and teachers and educators on mental health and recognizing the reality of it. That's something that we see that's very prevalent in our organization within the youth that we serve. And also just in the nonprofit space in general, there is a lot of talk around burnout and things like that. So I think for our organization, we've really taken up the mantle, partnering with organizations like Caleb's Kids Foundation and receiving sponsorships from local companies to really drive mental health awareness. And it was something that happened it was as a result of a tragedy, but it happened organically in the way that we were like, we don't want to see this trend. Young people ages 15 to 24, it is the leading cause of death. Suicide is the leading cause of death, the third leading cause of death for youth ages 15 to 24. So I would say that it is a crisis, and we're working very diligently to connect our young people to resources, to have resources on site at our facility. We always share, we just connected our youth pro bono through a partnership with psychotherapists, and also recognizing that therapy is also a privilege, right? And trying to explore other avenues of wellness and wholeness that serves the whole person and looking at how the system itself plays a role in mental health, because you can't talk about mental health just silo. You have to talk about all the other things. And so we're very intentional about tackling on that. I hope that answered your question.
I'll just piggyback off that real quick. I think it was not an intentional part of how we built out our program to start. I think where it became very prevalent, you know, you learn like piece by piece about students, particularly for us as we work with them over a course of time. You learn about their backgrounds, you learn about their parents and their parents' backgrounds, if they're living with their parents, you learn about all these things. And I think where that really comes to a head is when they do graduate high school. I think that's a very interesting, pivotal moment for the students that we've worked with, and something that I really personally experienced when our first group graduated in 2016. Many of the demons from their past resurfaced when they were out on their own or when they're trying to figure out what comes next. And so as a result of that, that is something that now, and I'd love to talk more just about some of your partnerships, because it's not like, we also, you know, recognize that we can't be everything, and we shouldn't, because we won't do it well. But who are the partners that can come on board, that can piggyback off of the trusting relationship we've built with these young people, to be able to have on-site partners like that for the young people to talk to, because so many of them might talk to me, but I'm not well prepared, and I'm not trained to be able to deal with that, and so I can listen all the time, but that's something that we very much realized in that first year out of high school, as a truly pivotal moment where things shift quite a bit.
And can I piggyback? I think something very practical that would help a lot of practitioners, youth practitioners, is to like a train-the-trainer model on like trauma-informed care. I think that is something that should be incorporated into every avenue, because you speak about like demons of the past, where it's really just trauma from their childhood manifesting into their young adult lives. And so I think that being trauma-informed is incredibly important. And so there are tons of trainings, not enough talk around trauma-informed care, but I think that goes hand in hand with mental health.
I'm a big fan of kind of stepping more broadly than the kind of medical model of mental health that we often have, and both of you, like, the ways you were talking almost completely assumed a whole person approach that's very different than just a medical model of mental health. I'm a licensed master social worker. In macro practice, I can't help you with your problems, but give me like 12 people and you in a room and I can make you all deal with each other's problems. But I'm very, very big fan, just to be clear, I am not a clinical therapist, but really strong advocate for therapy, and think that clinical therapists are really powerful. I do think we need a lot more than that. We need to recognize that mental health is so much bigger and needs more than a whole bunch of clinical therapists. Yes. An army of social workers is not going to solve the mental health crises we're facing. And so some of what I would think about, like you asked about the tours, part of why we focus on stories is getting to hear a person's story helps you connect with their mental health, their mental well-being, understand what trauma they've experienced. I would encourage all of you that care about mental health to take the time to get to know someone that's struggling with a mental health crisis and listen to them. And tell your own story, too. Mental health involves mental health crises involve a lot of delusional thinking. You're missing a lot of aspects of reality, so you actually need people that will both listen to and believe and understand you, but also sort of go, that doesn't make sense, though. Like, can we talk about how that doesn't make sense? And wrestle through those conversations of helping them come to terms with their own struggles to understand themselves, to understand the world. So I don't think that's something you can do on a tour, but I do think if you get around Detroit and start to hang out in some of these places, work with some of these organizations, you get the opportunity. And I would also say, don't underestimate. I think we often think like we have to like have this massive space that we create to make an impact, or that we have to be a trained professional. I know that in some of my mental health crises, it was actually someone that just listened to me over the course of a few months And they're a person I hold treasured now in my life, but I'm not necessarily close with them anymore. And for kids going through crisis particularly, they need those people. So take the time to listen and to hear their story, and also to bring your own story to the table. That, I think, is really one of the most important things we can do if we care about mental health.
It's 10 a.m., so I want to make sure that I respect all of your time. Can we give them a round of applause? And if you have any other questions, or if you just want to meet them, please come and introduce yourself or ask any further questions that you might have. So thank you, all three of you, very much for your time and for all that you do for the city. We appreciate it, and keep up the good work. Thanks.
Thank you.